All right, last little bit of the lecture on reproduction, talking about the comparison between metatherians and eutherians. So we went over a whole list of reasons why marsupials may be inferior to eutherian mammals. So the question remains, is this because of reproduction, because they give birth to such undeveloped young, or are there other explanations for why maybe they can't compete or be as widely distributed or be as speciose as eutherian mammals? So definitely we've seen, because of the way they're born so early, it does limit the kinds of environments where you find them, right? So you don't find marsupials in the Antarctic because the fetuses would not be able to develop outside of the mother's body. Mammals that do live in the Antarctic or polar regions give birth to very precocial offspring that are able to maintain their body temperature and have fur and all those good things. So marsupials definitely can't compete in that kind of environment. They can't be fully aquatic because the offspring need to be able to breathe oxygen out of the air. They can't get it out of the water. So because they're not contained in the mother's body, they don't have a way to develop if they're underwater. So we don't have fully aquatic marsupials. So mode of reproduction makes a big difference. But there are other things that are different between eutherians and metatherians that may also account for this inability to compete that we see in the marsupials. For example, their cerebral cortex is much smaller, it's much smoother, it doesn't have all the wrinkles in it that we see in eutherians, and it develops more slowly over their course of their early lives. So as a result, marsupials aren't as flexible in their behavior, they're not as capable of learning, you don't see the complexity of behavior that we see in eutherian species. So that also may limit them in terms of competition with eutherians. Then they also have a smaller number of chromosomes than eutherians, and that does limit the number of chromosomal rearrangements that you can see, so that to a certain extent may slow down their ability to adapt to environmental changes, so that makes them less evolutionarily flexible. Finally, their reproductive rate is, on the whole, lower than eutherians. So they give birth to a relatively small number of offspring, and even though their period of gestation is very short, those offspring are dependent on the mother's milk for a fairly long period of time. So they have a slow rate of development throughout the time of dependency on the mother, whether that's the period that they're in the uterus or the period that they're out of the uterus but still nursing. So that means over the course of a year, female marsupials are not able to produce, in general, as many offspring as eutherian mammals of the same size. So if they're both in the same habitats, the eutherian mammals can produce lots and lots of offspring, and the population size grows relatively quickly, whereas the metatherians are not able to produce quite so many offspring and population grows much more slowly. But that doesn't mean then that reproduction is completely to blame for the lack of competition. It may be part of the story, but probably not the full story. And it turns out that the marsupial mode of reproduction is actually can be seen as advantageous in certain kinds of situations. And in particular, where the energy availability, the amount of resources in the environment is very, very low, the marsupial reproductive strategy is good for that kind of situation because it requires a small amount of resources spread out over a very long period of time. So that kind of buffers them in situations where the resources might not always be available or may fluctuate unpredictably. Whereas the eutherian that needs a greater influx of resources over a shorter period of time, they may not be able to successfully reproduce in the same kinds of situations where metatherians can reproduce. A second advantage to the reproductive strategy of metatherians is that lost offspring can be replaced very, very quickly. So remember, we talked about embryonic diapause. Those offspring that are in that dormant condition in the female's uterus are quickly able to be born to replace offspring that die along the way. And so the female doesn't need to wait a whole reproductive season to cycle through another set of reproductive events. So that is also an advantage in some kinds of environments. So it's a mixed bag. There are certain things that are disadvantages, and there are other things that may be advantages in certain environments. So in some situations, marsupials may be able to compete very, very effectively with eutherian mammals, but in other situations, in the Arctic, in the skies, flying around, in the oceans, they're not able to compete.